Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and for listening to my wonderful speech here. My name is Tom Antle. I'm Director of Engineering at a company called TorchLight Bioresources, mechanical engineer by training, and also a master's in industrial sustainable decarbonization from KTH in Stockholm. Today I'm talking about carbon removals and BECCS in Canada, as you might have guessed. I must admit, I missed the note on the very nice BECCS graphics, so you're going to see some simplified versions here coming up. So who is TorchLight? So we're a bioenergy firm. We operate at the intersection of forestry and energy, and as you can imagine, that involves a heavy dose of carbon as well. For around 15 years, we've been focusing on policy and strategic work with large emitters, different levels of government, and in industry associations. And this includes many technology evaluations across the whole spectrum of bioenergy, including liquid fuels, gasifiers, combustion, all manner of, and biochar as well. In the last few years, we've switched modes a little bit and moved it more into project development, and we have a very strong focus on, a typo, geez, on establishing commercial technologies. So for us, we're focusing exclusively on solid wood fuels, and where we see this being most competitive is in combined heat and power, both for district heating by hot water and also for industrial heat as well. And then also, which brings me here, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage as an extension of those. So what am I talking about when I talk about biomass combined heat and power? So this is a single plant that produces both heat and electricity at the same time from a single fuel. This produces very high efficiencies, and solid biomass fuels like these, forest residues, wood chips, hog fuel from sawmill residues, are burned conventionally in a steam boiler. That makes high pressure superheated steam, which can be then sent to a turbine to generate electricity. And then with the exhaust steam, we can also make either process heat or hot water. A key thing here is that the fuel needs are more or less unselective on both species and quality and a number of other factors that the traditional forest industry, when making pulp or solid wood products, really care about. This is very well established in commercial technology, thousands of units globally and hundreds in Canada. And one thing I would say here is that the stock of biomass boilers that we have in Canada is very old. So the newest pulp mill in Canada was built in 1990, which is a couple of years before I was born. So in that time, the air emissions equipment and regulations have come a long way. So what we see is that a new biomass boiler the air emissions are actually less when equipped with the proper equipment, less than a natural gas furnace would produce from a residential building. So here's an example of a couple of these modern plants. So this plant is in Stockholm. It's operated by the district heating company, which I used to work for. So it's a 410 megawatt biomass boiler exclusively on wood chips. Produces both electricity and heat for the district heating network, which provides heat to about 90% of the buildings in Stockholm. Around 1.2 million tons a year delivered right into the heart of fuel delivered right into the heart of the city. And you can imagine in Stockholm the Swedes are known for fairly environmentally conscious, so this plant is permitted to very, very low levels, and they achieve it regularly. Here's a slightly larger unit in Copenhagen, 550 megawatts. Again, 1.5 million tons a year delivered right into the heart of the city. And I think there's no getting around that these are big plants, but also that you can do some good work and make them look pretty nice. So this brings us to BECCS technology. So when we expand this from combined heat and power, as mentioned earlier, we have all this biogenic carbon going up into the atmosphere. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is kind of the logical extension of that. So from our project development work, what we can say is that capture technology for biomass flue gas exists and works. And in many ways, that biomass flue gas is broadly similar to the flue gas from coal plants, which, not advocating for coal here, but a lot of research work has gone into trying to capture the emissions from coal plants. And so we can kind of piggyback on a lot of that knowledge. In fact, there's some benefits to the biomass. For example, there's less metals in wood than there are in coal, so it in some ways makes the capture a little bit easier. You can sign a commercial contract today for delivery of both small modular plants, which you see here. That's a 100,000 ton per year unit, but also for very large custom plants of the type that have been built in a couple of places already in Canada. But just to say that these plants, if you have the project behind it, you can get one delivered. One of the things that's interesting is when we're talking about carbon capture on fossil fuel power generation, there's a very high emphasis on efficiency, and the reason for that is because additional energy use is a cost for a power generator. In BECCS, the calculus is a little bit reversed because the combusted fuel is actually your product. So the more fuel you burn, the more CDRs you have, it enables you to scale the plant and capture those economies of scale. So a lot of the good work that's gone into making these plants more efficient for one application, the restrictions are slightly eased when we're talking about BECCS, so it does make the project a little bit easier. And crucially, when we're talking about biofuels for these plants, the value is actually in the carbon, not in the energy value. So this is kind of turns the traditional wood residue fuels market on its head a little bit, because typically it's the fuel that people are trying to get rid of, very low cost, fairly low quality fuel as far as energy content goes. When we're looking at the value in the carbon, it changes everything. And so it enables delivery from much longer distances, from different sources, and from different markets than were possible before. So here's my simplified version of the nice pictures you saw earlier. I think it gets the same point across. So in Canada, a typical pulp mill emits around 1.1 to 2 million tons a year of biogenic carbon today, depending on the scale. So these are fairly large point sources of emissions. And the reason for that is about half the wood that enters a pulp mill to make pulp and paper actually ends up being combusted in one way or another in a boiler. So these are, one way to look at a pulp mill is that it's basically a CHP, combined heat and power plant, that also happens to make pulp. So this is why BECCS is such a logical extension to add to a pulp mill. So what we do here is, as mentioned earlier, today it's being released, the biogenic carbon is being released back into the atmosphere. The way that we would capture that is we'd add a capture plant. The carbon capture requires a new source of electricity and heat, and so we add an additional CHP to provide that in many cases. And so we can take advantage of the existing biomass supply chain that's already coming to the mill, expand it a little bit, of course. And in Alberta, it's really nice because the mills are relatively close to sequestration or storage sites. I like to say sequestration because to me storage sounds like it's going to come back up at some point, which it's not. So the mills are relatively close to sequestration sites. So when we see what the sequestration costs are in places like Norway, where the Northern Lights project is doing offshore subsurface CO2 sequestration shipped in on liquid CO2 tankers. In Alberta, it's a pipeline, a couple, tens of kilometers and straight down into the basin. So that basically gives you a global advantage on cost. We see BECCS as the lowest cost approach for permanent removals. And one of the key things here is that it's just added to an existing industry. And so you get to leverage all of the business structures and all of the supply chains that are already in place, and you add an additional product. So you turn this non-liability of biogenic CO2 into a new source of revenue, and in some cases, a very significant one. We come at BECCS in many cases from a forestry point of view. That's a big part of what we do. And when we're talking about BECCS, we also have to talk about fires, because in today's world and in the last few years, that is the other side of the coin. So in Canada, 94% of the forests are actually owned by the provinces, and then forest companies have tenure on those. So the forest companies, of course, manage and make use of the forest for their own business, but the guidelines that are given to them are put in place by the province. And so what we see is a bit of a failure on the part of the forest owner to invest in management and long-term profitability of their assets in the forest, because we've let these fires grow and grow and grow, in many cases due to climate change, drought, insects, but there's been very little effort invested in trying to keep them on a sustainable basis under management. So we know that this is possible because in places like Sweden, they harvest 7 times as much wood per hectare on average than in Canada. And a big part of that is there's 50 times less fire per hectare. So we know that a change is possible. Obviously, Sweden is not Canada, but certainly we can start moving in that direction. So one of the things we can do are activities called fire smarting. So this is, what would be thinning or basically cleaning up the forest so that there's less fuels on the ground. Doesn't mean necessarily removing large numbers of trees, but definitely removing the smaller ones, removing the ones on the ground, maybe some of the low-hanging branches. And these are activities that are being undertaken right now, particularly around communities and industrial sites. But to see a bigger step change in the amount of fires happening, they would have to be over much larger areas than we see today. And these cost money because it's a lot of manual work. So it's a fairly expensive treatment, which today is only worth it around communities, more or less. The other thing is it produces a lot of really low quality and really high cost biomass, which nobody really wants for those two reasons. But as mentioned earlier, a biomass boiler can make use of that. And because with the addition of BECCS, the value of the CDRs is such that it can start to take advantage of those fuels. So BECCS can provide a market for this and kind of reduce the overall cost of fire smarting. And this is the data that more or less shows what can happen and what is happening. So over my lifetime, the forests in Canada have gone from a net sink of carbon to a net source of carbon, mainly due to climate change. But then we can also see that 2023 was a particularly bad year. Forest fires in Canada emitted 2.4 billion tons of CO2. So to put that in perspective, that's over 3 times all the other anthropogenic emissions in Canada, and 75% more than all of the emissions from the oil sands in their entire history. So that's in 1 year. So what we see is that if we're unwilling to tackle this forest problem on the climate change front, there's very little point in doing a lot else. So we see this as a big priority. And this is just an example of what forest treatments look like. So an example from California, you can see very intense burning with no treatment. On the far left, some treatment, and then in the middle, a more advanced treatment. So these treatments do make a difference on how intense the fires are, leading to which helps control of them, but also reduces the release of carbon from the forest and keeps the forest on the ground. So how do we put this ledger to work? We got to work both sides of the carbon ledger. A lot of talk is about reducing emissions, but we also have these negative emissions, which we can balance it out. So what we see is that CDRs from BECCS, particularly in Alberta, are oftentimes lower cost than, for example, liquid fuels, particularly for sustainable aviation fuel. Like these numbers are getting into crazy town as far as what people are willing to pay for decarbonization. So we have to kind of be a little bit realistic around the negative side of the ledger, and is it better off to keep emitting in some places while taking a negative in another place at a lower cost? The big question, of course, is who pays for this? So one thing that people mention as well, we could build biomass power plants, sell electricity. In our work, we find that this is too expensive if it's only power. And we don't think ratepayers are willing or should be willing to pay for that. Taxpayers, that's basically funds from the government. A lot of discussion around that in policy circles on pros and cons. What we see from a public perspective point of view is it's difficult to keep the enthusiasm up, and it's difficult to align your average taxpayer with their emissions goal with this outcome. So it becomes a more difficult story. I think for us, we see it coming back to emitters. So this can directly connect the actual removals to an actual emission and through a carbon charge. So this is different than a carbon tax because you'd only be charged, for example, for a removal that actually takes place. So it feels a bit more, connected. And so we can see that these pulp mills and other biogenic facilities, they can actually start to help decarbonize these difficult to abate places like airlines, like lime kilns, like a number of other high-value decarbonization efforts. So how does this fit into Alberta and Canada? So, of course, as you can see here, this is sequestration. Alberta's the place to do it, a bit in Saskatchewan, but really Alberta's the place to do it. Alberta also has a very vibrant forest industry. And Alberta, I think, is oftentimes noted for having 55% of Canadian industrial emissions. So any effort around reducing Canadian emissions is going to impact Alberta particularly hard. But Alberta can also offer the rest of Canada very low-cost decarbonization through BECCS. So they have the forestry, they have the sequestration, and they also have the regulation and licensing, which is some of the best in the world as far as being able to actually move a project forward. So how would this actually work? One way it could work is if the CDR purchases from the plant were backstopped by the government, but not necessarily paid for by the government. So this would be through a regulated plant model, so no one's making out like a bandit on the economics. And then the province actually owns the above ground carbon in the form of trees, and they regulate and own the below ground carbon. So it's more like a carbon tolling agreement, where a regulated plant moves carbon from above ground sources and stores it below. Now these would be sold to emitters potentially in Canada, but also globally. So it's a new export product for the province. Alberta loves to export things, so we can continue to help within Canada, but then also export to new markets globally. Thank you very much. That's everything I had.